4 and 5 year sentences for Whole Truth 5. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Social media is alive with comments about the Whole Truth 5, a group of Just Stop Oil activists who were recently sentenced to 4 and 5 year prison sentences for their activism, reportedly because of a Zoom call. That's the focus of most comments. But in fact, the upshot of the Zoom call is that they were conspiring to block pretty much all of the traffic on major routes in the UK through their actions. And that's what the judge convicted them of. So I'd like to walk through this presentation, show you some of the comments from the court proceedings, some of the media comments, and I'd also like to alert you to the fact that a group called Last Generation in Canada is part of an international group planning to do major civil disobedience disruptions. I don't know what they are, but in light of what happened in the UK, people should be paying attention to this. I'm sure there are very many well-intentioned young people involved in this where they think that, they're afraid of climate change. They're, in one of their letters to the Prime Minister, they say that the UN has told us we only have 2 years left. The UN has never told you that. In fact, the lead author of the UN report publicly stated that the report never said that we have only a few years left. And many very well respected climate scientists like Mike Hume have spoken out about the problems with these climate emergency declarations and telling people that there's some kind of a time deadline when that's not the case, because it leads to either very authoritarian, tyrannical government action, or it leads to this kind of perhaps well-intentioned but completely inappropriate and criminal activity that harms a lot of people. So these direct action civil disobedience plans can lead to a lot of trouble for society at large and also for the individuals involved. So my preference, and I think that of our society, is that we should engage in open civil debate and full cost benefit analysis of all kinds of climate and energy projects and hopefully avoid these kinds of confrontations. So let me walk you through the materials that I've put together here, and I'd be happy to have your comments down below in our YouTube comments. So 4 and 5 year sentences for the Whole Truth 5. So the Metropolitan Police in the UK is saying everyone has a right to protest, but no one has the right to break the law. We welcome this sentencing and hope it acts as a deterrent to those who intend to cause disproportionate disruptions to Londoners. Now, these people are part of Just Stop Oil, and this fellow here was formerly part of Extinction Rebellion. The whole principle of Just Stop Oil is that they are telling the sole truth about climate change. And let's go through this and see what kind of truths they're telling. Anyway, they all look pretty happy here. That was probably before they got their sentence. The Conversation has an article. Just Stop Oil's harsh sentences are the logical outcome of Britain's authoritarian turn against protest. So they obviously think that this is inappropriate, and they say, for a non-violent protest, there's no equivalent in modern times. But here's what the Crown versus Hallam and others has to say. This is what the judge said. I have to sentence all 5 of you for the offense of conspiracy intentionally to cause a public nuisance of which you were each convicted by the jury following a trial, which concluded a week ago. The conspiracy in question involved a sophisticated plan to disrupt traffic on the M25 roadway by means of protesters climbing up the gantries over the motorway. And the conspiracy bore fruit. There was a disruption on the M25 on 4 successive days from the 7th to the 10th of November 2022. Over 45 protesters climbed or attempted to climb up the gantries at various points. Every sector of this orbital motorway was affected. This disruptive protest action under the auspices of an organization now well known called Just Stop Oil, of which you are all committed activists. These protests cause massive disruption. The Police and National Highways Limited, the public body which owns and is responsible for the running of the UK's motorway network, had no choice but to close large sections of the motorway each day, causing long tailbacks. Now, I guess the sentencing came as a bit of a surprise, because before, the kind of court premise was if you went to court and accepted your guilt, you would be rewarded with lenient sentences. This is called Hoffman's bargain. And you can read more about that in this article in Modern Law Review. However, a key point here is that defendants who claim duress may act for different motives as long as one is the avoidance of death or serious injury. So here's part of the injury and harm that was caused to the public. This is again from the trial proceedings. At trial, the jury heard evidence quantifying the huge disruption caused. The total road impact time over the 4 days was 121 hours and 45 minutes. The total extent of delay to road users is calculated at 50,856 hours, and the number of affected vehicles at 708,523. The total economic cost for the 4 days of disruption is put at £769,966 sterling. Cost incurred by the Metropolitan Police alone, and 5 other forces were involved given the geography of the M25 highway, was over £1 million. But the kicker is that the intended outcome was much bigger. So these are some of the things that the judge in the trial read off regarding some of the impacts of protests on ordinary members of the public. People missed flights, people missed funerals, school students were delayed for their mock exams, a child with special needs on his way to school who missed part of the school day and his medication, which placed the taxi driver driving him there at risk, as the child could become volatile without his medication. Other school students with special education needs being delayed on their way to school, someone suffering from an aggressive form of cancer who missed an appointment at a cancer clinic and had to wait 2 months for a further appointment, people who were late to work and had to work extra hours without pay to make up the time, an HGV driver unable to deliver £5,000 worth of food to a hospital, and perhaps ironically, given the causes you espouse, an individual invited to answer questions at the House of Lords before the all-party parliamentary group for water, who was unable to attend the meeting and incurred wasted expenses. Now, apparently this is a transcript of what Roger Hallam said during the Zoom call, and he's the fellow who was formerly with Extinction Rebellion and now is with Just Stop Oil. I really like super significant aspect of this project, which takes it away from anything that has happened before, and that's that it has the potential to create gridlock. In other words, if we take a section of motorway, a circular motorway, people block gantries at close equidistant spaces around that circle at a certain time of day, the whole motorway will fill up with cars, and then no one will be able to get onto that motorway, and it will back up on all the other motorways and all the other A roads. In other words, it will cause 100 times more disruption than simply 2 or 3 people doing it, right? And there's a whole mathematics around it. But you have to take it on trust, as it were. That's what they're saying to us to do. Now, I find that comment right here very, very interesting. Like, who is they? Who's telling these young people and a couple of rather more senior people like Roger and one of his accomplices, who is telling them to do this? It sounds like there's some other body behind this whole thing that's actually figured it out. Perhaps the funders of this group. And I think in these situations we should consider that there may be foreign forces who are interested in disrupting the economies of the Western world for nefarious purposes. It may be part of a hybrid war against the West, where, you know, we may be fighting, say, in the Ukraine or in Israel or in other parts of the world with weapons, but other parties are perhaps funding some of these groups. And again, they're capitalizing on the good intentions and the fear of these young people. And they're what, you know, it's kind of rude, but Lenin used to call them useful idiots, you know, people who didn't look beyond the surface and just acted out without thinking twice, without saying, wait a minute, you know, what if that was my mom stuck in a car, needed to get to her cancer clinic and couldn't get there? What if that was my dad in an ambulance? What if it was my best friend, you know, who couldn't pass her exams because she couldn't get to the school in time? You know, I don't think that people are often thinking beyond the, shall we say, eco-martyrdom and heroism, you know, climate hero actions. So I hope that's something that young people will keep in mind and start to think about. And I hope that's something that also public officials will start to consider. These are not grassroots actions as we see here. This is very, very well planned and very sophisticated action. So it's not just a simple little grassroots operation where 4 or 5 people decide to go block a highway. And this commentator on Twitter, or X as it's called now, basically says they have blood on their hands. Just Stop Oil protesters on the Dartford Bridge earlier this week now have blood on their hands, a man has said, who was badly injured trying to help 2 women needing assistance on the M20. The 2 women the man was trying to help were involved in a crash, but due to the traffic caused by the Dartford Bridge, the ambulance was delayed in arriving, leading to their deaths. That's just tragic. So quite a few people in the UK appear to be upset and tired of this kind of activism. And so this press report says, judge who spoke for all of us on eco-fanatics. Each of you crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic, bound neither by the principles of democracy nor the rule of law, heedless of the rights of your fellow citizens. And this is what the judge said. And your fanaticism makes you entirely heedless of the rights of your fellow citizens. You have taken upon yourselves to decide that your fellow citizens must suffer disruption and harm, and how much disruption and harm they must suffer, simply so that you may parade your views. Your attitude to the rule of law was manifested during your trial, with the exception of Lucia Whitaker de Abreu, who was represented until close to the end of the trial. You embarked on a calculated campaign to disrupt proceedings as far as you possibly could. And he also said, but because your perspective is basically that the criminal law really doesn't matter because of climate change, and because you think the harm caused by breaking the law is justified by reference to your goals, there is a real risk that each of you committing further serious offenses in pursuit of your objectives, unless you are deterred from doing so by exemplary sentences in this case. So just to point out again here, so obviously it's not just about having a Zoom call. It's about conspiring to have a very large direct action. Even though it was nonviolent, that's true. But the intention was to completely disrupt a very large section of England at a very critical time and with critical functions like flights, transportation, hospital needs, the needs of children, the needs of the sick, and without concern for those people's needs, and claiming that climate change is the overriding necessity. Now, ironically, here's the National Observer in Canada and comments by Chris Hatch. And the headline says, "Zooming off to jail for climate activism." And it says, "Better scrutinize the participants list on your next Zoom call. 5 climate activists in the UK just got multi-year jail sentences for planning a peaceful demonstration that disrupted traffic. They were convicted of conspiring to cause a public nuisance." And so the United Nations rapporteur, Michelle Forrest, was shocked, facing several years of imprisonment for taking part in a Zoom call. "This is something I have not seen anywhere else, and it is shockingly disproportionate." But, ironically, Chris Hatch is married to Tzipora Berman, who's well known in Canada for blocking pipelines and the war in the woods against the forestry industry in British Columbia, for disrupting oil sands, and generally being a nuisance, a public nuisance. And guess who's on a Zoom call with special guest Tzipora Berman? Now, this took place on July the 4th, and this is the start of an international uprising to disarm oil. Are you in? International uprising against our murderous governments. So they're really ramping up the rhetoric here. We won't fix the climate crisis with one country. That's why we're coming together to take action across 8 different countries as we call for international change and a fossil fuel treaty. Hear the plan and how to be involved. So they go on to say, "This might be our last chance to get real action on the climate crisis. Join our international Zoom call with exciting special guests, Dr. Tzipora Berman, the chair and founder of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty." And that initiative to learn more about the treaty and how we need to work internationally to make it happen. So the international calls are a chance to connect with people around the world who are going to take action at airports this summer across the world. Now they go on to falsely claim that we've been told by the UN that we have less than 2 years to save humanity, and it barely cracks CBC News. We've seen years and years of inaction and expansion of the oil and gas industry, and our government can't even implement a national firefighting agency to handle the impacts of climate crisis now. Well, we do have a national coordination center for all of the provincial firefighting agencies, and it's very doubtful that a national one would be very helpful. However, they go on to say, so we have to do what they can't. We have to come together internationally as ordinary people to defend our right to a livable future. And so just remember, they're saying they're going to take action at airports this summer across the world. And international uprising to end fossil fuels with special guest Dr. Tzipora Berman. Sounds kind of like a conspiracy to me. And let us recall the sentence for the Whole Truth 5. I have to sentence you for the offense of conspiracy intentionally to cause a public nuisance, and that it was a conspiracy that involved a sophisticated plan. In this case, it was to disrupt traffic. In the UK, it sounds like the new plan is going to be to disrupt traffic at airports. So Last Generation, now I'm switching topics to this group that's advocating for the action against airports. And so you can see they have apocalyptic rhetoric and an apocalyptic name, the Last Generation. They also want you to donate 1 hour of wages, and also for their legal defense. So they claim that their plan is civil resistance as our last chance at survival. The civil rights movement to the Indian independence movement. History shows its most effective way. We are trained and we are nonviolent. Well, even if you're nonviolent, if you're causing disruption to ordinary people, it's a problem. Iteration is the key. We will win. So they claim that they're just like the suffragettes and freedom riders, and that they will persist and continue to engage in sustained disruption day in and day out. We are the last generation. We cannot afford to lose. Well, you're not the last generation. So it's just apocalyptic rhetoric. And they talk here about why disruption. They say that scientists, the IPCC, and the UN have been calling on the world to take action, yet nothing has changed. Continuing business as usual is genocidal. So you might wonder about their methods. Here they are doing exactly the same kinds of things that the 5 people in the UK did from Just Stop Oil. Now, this is on to Ottawa. This is a forerunner to the Last Generation group. And they claim that there's a moral imperative to engage in nonviolent civil resistance. See how you can get involved to change the world. And just a reminder what the judge said in the Crown versus Hallam. And your fanaticism makes you entirely heedless of the rights of your fellow citizens. You have taken upon yourselves to decide that your fellow citizens must suffer disruption and harm, and how much disruption and harm they must suffer, simply so that you may parade your views. So who's funding these guys? Well, the Climate Emergency Fund is an environmentalist grant-making organization. It's drawn controversy for providing funds to a number of disruptive activist groups, including Just Stop Oil, a group responsible for viral stunts to protest climate change, such as an incident in London's National Gallery in October of 2022, when 2 members threw soup on the glass display of Vincent van Gogh's 1888 painting Sunflowers, while also gluing themselves to the wall adjacent to the painting. And ironically, Eileen Getty is the founding donor of Climate Emergency Fund, the heiress to the Getty family fortune established by oil magnate J. Paul Getty. So some people will say, well, that makes no sense. Well, it may make sense. Sometimes these people appear to be repentant for the fact that they inherited all this money from their big oil magnate forebearer. They're invested in renewables, then they're actually forcing the government through this kind of extortionary and intimidative action to fund renewables, which comes, of course, with subsidies from your pocket. So it's not a grassroots operation. It's very well planned. And in fact, the U.S. right now is looking into what they call the climate cartel via the House Judiciary Committee. And they found that a lot of these major financial institutions and such like, and groups like GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, are actually skewing markets all over the world, and in many cases, some of these parties are funding these proxy groups like Just Stop Oil, or like the Canadian version, The Last Generation, which does have factions elsewhere. And here's a Time story, just so that you know it's not a tinfoil hat theory. Who's behind the group? Just Stop Oil gets its funding via donations from the public, private individuals, and grants. and the US-based Climate Emergency Fund. And in the UK, it turns out that Extinction Rebellion billionaire funds Cannes Climate Network. So Sir Christopher Hone, a financier whose investments include a stake in the owner of Heathrow Airport, has donated more than £670 million to climate campaigns via his philanthropic fund in less than a decade. So also Michael Bloomberg here. These guys are also pushing the C40 cities. This C40 cities want you to have a 2.9 ton CO2e carbon footprint per year. Most people in Canada have something more in the order of 17 tons CO2e. So obviously there's some big dark money in the background. Anyway, Last Generation has set up a demand here. They want the government to join the call for fossil fuel treaty to manage global transition to a safe, renewable, and affordable energy for all. And more of their rationale is here. But they also issued a demand letter back in June when they did this action and their Zoom call. A demand letter to Prime Minister Trudeau. And they claim in this letter, as Prime Minister, your continued support for the oil industry, evidenced by billions of dollars in funding, is deeply concerning. Financing the climate criminals driving global warming is fueling the destruction of our forests and poses threats to human health, food security, our economy, and global peace. Put simply, fossil fuels will kill people and destroy everything we hold dear. That's not true, but we won't argue about it right here. Continuing to extract and burn fossil fuels is nothing short of an act of war against small island nations, communities in the global south, and a betrayal to Indigenous peoples. Actually, the oil industry employs the most Indigenous people in Canada, that's the oil sands, who bear the brunt of the wildfire crisis in Canada. Of course, we have wildfires every year in Canada, and we can prepare for it with FireSmart. It strips everyone in this country of their right to a livable future. So that's an excerpt from their demand letter. And then they go on to say, we require that your government fulfills its mandate to uphold the health, safety, life, and liberty of the public by endorsing and committing to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty in a way that is legally binding. If you do not approve, or if you do not provide such assurance by the 12th of July, 2024, that's just a few days ago, we will be forced to do what your government can't and take action to protect our communities. We will do so by engaging in a campaign of internationally coordinated nonviolent civil resistance. That sounds like a conspiracy to me. Our collective future is at risk. Canada is burning to the ground. This might be our last chance. Canada's not burning to the ground. We're fine. So just to get a handle on how radical these people are, if we go back to Extinction Rebellion, this is Roger Hallam, and he was one of the people convicted in his alliance with the Just Stop Oil Group. Of course, they always say tell the truth. But he's threatening to bring down governments and says that some may die in the process. And they state here, and of course this is from 2019, so a bit out of date, but I don't think the ideology has changed. Extinction Rebellion's blocking of bridges around the world aims to establish an eco-centered oligarchy. Governments of the world must accept their beliefs and declare a climate and ecological emergency. The same governments must commit to slaughtering their economies to arrive to net zero emissions by 2025. And governments must submit their authority to what Extinction Rebellion call citizens' assemblies on climate and ecological justice. The latter is nothing short of a transfer of democratic power to oligarchies of frantic enviro-zealots compelled by their imagined threat of planetary doom. And as we saw earlier, perhaps to the benefit of various wealthy people who are funding them. Now, this goes back to 2020, but you can see how dangerous this kind of ideology is. At that time, Extinction Rebellion was planning for public suicides at the Glasgow Climate Conference. And when you have very impressionable young people who have been driven into a panic by this outrageous rhetoric, they're quite easily swayed to do things that, in a normal context, they would not do. These things would be life-changing or life-ending. And, we can't allow this type of thing to continue. This is far beyond public protest, which is legal. Public protest is legal, but causing harm to people and driving people to the brink is not. And just for a quick reality check, these people want us to phase out fossil fuels immediately, and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty intends to not ever allow any more fossil fuels to be developed in the world. Of course, no one in Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and any non-OECD country will take any notice of that. So really, they're just trying to crush the West. So that's again where I think people should consider, is this part of a hybrid war fronted by the climate change and ecological agenda? So we can see here that wind is the thin, dark blue line. Solar, modern biofuels, and other renewables are stacked on top of that. So really, the world runs on natural gas, oil, and coal, and traditional biomass. So if we were to follow the demands of these people, lots of people would die because we survive thanks to modern fossil fuels. And just to show how misinformed many of these activists are, they don't realize that for their renewables dream, you need a lot of oil, coal, and natural gas. But you may say, well, aren't we in a climate emergency? Don't we have to do something? Well, let's look at where this notion of a climate emergency came from. It came from the misuse of these computer scenarios, which were meant for research and not policy making. And the most extreme is called RCP 8.5. And this suggests that we were here in 2017, and the climate activists think that we are on this track to disaster, in their view. This is an implausible scenario. It requires the use of more coal than exists on Earth. It includes 3 to 6 billion more people on the planet by 2100 than even the UN forecasts. It would require the quadrupling of oil development, which is impossible. So why do these exist? Well, it's a research project. These scenarios were developed for lab research. They were designed to show sort of what would be the stronger driver of the warming influence of carbon dioxide and related socioeconomic factors. So the idea was like, well, what if we burned way more coal? What if we had way more people? What if, so they explored all these different possibilities, and that's how they came up with these different parameters or different outcomes. But these were never, ever meant for policy making. They were only meant for research. And they're useful for climate science researchers, but now people have adopted them as if these are the pathways that we can choose from. And that's not true, and it's caused people to think that there is a climate emergency because RCP 8.5 is almost without fail used in every catastrophic peer-reviewed paper that's out there. So whenever you see RCP 8.5 mentioned in a peer-reviewed paper, take it with a grain of salt. So, if we remove these implausible and exaggerated scenarios from the equation, you can see that there's no climate emergency, and we do have time. Now, this whole idea of staying below 1.5 or 2 degrees, it's really a delusion. We live in a democracy, and as with any topic, there will be diverse points of view and demands for change depending on one's values, but we have to find solutions that are cost-effective and reasonable. So I would say that most of these activists are here. They're terrified of a climate apocalypse. They may decide to go vegan, not to have children, not to drive, or they may engage in other sacrifice to save the planet, which in this case has meant that their sacrifice is going to jail. Of course, on the other end, there are people who are unconcerned about climate, but they're more concerned maybe about health care, education, the economy, jobs, trade, immigration, or global terrorism. And then in the middle, we have different climate diversity views. Like some are more concerned about pollution than climate, actual pollution, whether it be plastics or oil spills or air pollution. Some are concerned about human impacts on climate, like the urban heat island effect. Some are concerned about climate and pollution, but they want to see a cost-benefit analysis. So it's one thing to say we're going to save the planet if we phase out oil, but if it means that, lots of people will die and all of the industry will be shut down, there won't be jobs, and that the change in temperature will be 0.007 degrees Celsius, that's not a very good cost-benefit. And some are worried about climate, but they find the messages very confusing and contradictory. Like, why does Al Gore fly so much? If there was warming and cooling before, how is this different? And some people, of course, and I would probably put these activists in that category, they feel angry that people think the economy matters over climate and the future of the planet. What about my kids? So that's often the thing that people say here, but actually people down here would also say, well, what about my kids? So my point is we have a broad range, a broad spectrum of climate diversity, and we should all be able to talk about it and not take part in these actions. And in Canada, of course, there are fundamental freedoms which are related to peaceful protest. And protest is legal and legitimate with conditions. And the condition is that it does not include the right to physically impede or blockade lawful activities. Now, this commentator on Twitter, or X, has suggested that it would have been poetic justice for those 5 Just Stop Oil morons to have been sentenced to spend their time on a treadmill, generating all the electricity they need for heating, lighting, hot water, food cooking, TV, and gadgets during their incarceration, so that fossil fuels didn't have to. But there's a better idea, and this comes from Jusper Machogu in Kenya. So his idea is maybe that protesters who do harm to sentence protesters who do harm to a season of low-carbon living. Now, he's running a sustainable internship program, and only 2 people have had the guts to try it, and at no point did they preach sustainable living. The ones who have been singing sustainable living and depending on Mother Nature for everything with zero impact have mostly ended up blocking me. So he's already made this offer to Greta Thunberg, Sophia Kiani, Bill McKibben, Mike Hudima, and Just Stop Oil, and Dad too at VP, who declined respectfully, etc. None has signed up for it. Send me your kids and relatives. I will show them where food comes from. Just stop toil. And here's Jusper commenting on this trial. He could have interned with me, but instead he opted for jail. He'd have spent some time learning how to farm, fetch water and firewood, hand wash clothes, prepare charcoal, look after cattle and milk, etc., instead of committing an offense. Just stop toil. So, Jusper continues to offer this. And last year we built some young, beautiful kids a house. We got them connected to the grid as well. We've gotten their immediate neighbor connected to the grid. Clean lighting for my community. So this is like very incremental work that he's doing there, but he's gradually improving by hand the living standard of his community. Of course, if there was grid scale electricity in Africa, that would make a huge difference. So if you'd like to know more about Jusper and his circumstances, you can follow him on Twitter, or you can look at Climate the Movie and learn a lot about climate there as well. And of course, BBC comes out of the closet to smear Jusper as a climate change denier, and they did a lot of investigative research. Look at this. They've looked at the fundraising pages that he's set up and found that in the past 2 years, he's raised more than $9,000 from donations. $9,000. Did you see the money that Just Stop Oil is being funded by all these wealthy renewables investors? And he's commenting here in an article in the Daily Skeptic. Why is BBC Verify smearing a poor Kenyan farmer as a climate change denier? And he says here, I'm doing this for my people. No amount of money would make me betray my mom and hundreds of millions of other African moms who desperately need fossil fuels. So, you see, he could have been a climate activist and then he would have been traveling the world. But by saying fossil fuels for Africa, I have missed world travel in the name of climate change. I've missed funding in the millions of US dollars, a great life of less toil for my family and I. One wonders why I'd choose a broke Fossil Fuels for Africa campaign. Well, because he doesn't want his mother working hand to mouth in the field anymore. So here's a little campaign, Just Stop Toil. And cartoons by Josh is great. And Josh just came up with this fantastic cartoon. The Sustainability Internship Program. Why can't we just get food from the supermarket? Just stop toil. Fossil fuels for Africa. Poor Greta. So if you'd like to know more about climate and energy, please do come to our website, www.friendsofscience.org. The climate emergency is over. We do have time, and you can help us too. You can donate or send an e-transfer to contact@friendsofscience.org, and you can also join us. You can become a member and get all of our newsletters and see what kind of things we're up to. We're not planning any public disruptions at all. We plan to educate the public. I've always liked the theme that Nomi Site has on her website. And she's kind of the young contemporary woman who holds the opposite view of Greta. And she says, I don't want you to panic. I want you to think. So that's what we want you to do too. So I hope I've given you some food for thought here in this discussion. And thanks very much for watching. And do be on the lookout for those airport disruptors. And I hope that the courts will start to take these kind of activist operations seriously, because it's not some grassroots thing like what Jusper's doing. These are highly sophisticated, very well organized operations, very well funded, and it's about time that we stop scaring people about climate change. The climate emergency is over. We do have time, and let's get back to common sense and climate realism, because we're not going to reach net zero anytime soon. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.